Hi, welcome to my PostgreSQL project walkthrough. This project uses data from the sample database DVD rental, which is included in PostgreSQL. And I wanted to use this data to create some sort of scenario that I could use various SQL commands for to answer some sort of business question that might be relevant to a real-world company, DVD rental company in this case. And the business question that I chose to pursue was that of a inventory manager who may want to know which DVD titles were rented for what period of time, and he might want to know this to determine, which titles and which are rented out for a very long period of time and therefore unavailable on the shelves. And he may also want to know the frequency, he or she may want to know the frequency of those rentals to know how many titles of a particular DVD, how many copies to keep on the shelf. So that is my business question. And in order to answer that, the data that I need from the source data here in the schema for the tables of the DVD rental database are inventory and rental. Rental contains the columns rental ID, rental date, and return date, which are relevant to answering that question. It also contains the inventory ID, which is related, it's a foreign key to the inventory table, which has inventory ID as its primary key. And it also includes the film ID and the store ID, identifying which store and which titles apply to which inventory ID number. So these two tables and the columns I just discussed are what I will need to answer my questions. And so the first step in doing this was to, and this assignment is broken up into sections B through F. And the first part of this was to create tables where this raw data could be transferred to, so then it could then be further worked with and analyzed. So the two tables that I chose to create the two tables are a detailed table and a summary table for creating these detailed report and the summary report that would be useful to the inventory manager. So the rental detail table will pull the rental ID from the rental table, the store ID, the film ID, rental date, and return date. Okay, the store ID and film ID are coming from the inventory table, and the return date and rental date are coming from the rental table. But first step is just to create the table and create the columns, and later I will be populating it with that data. And then the second table is the rental summary table, including the store ID, same column, pulling from the same source inventory table, film ID, and then the new column that's going to be used here is times rented. This is the frequency, the number of times that a particular title was rented. So I'm going to go ahead and start walking through the code, the commands, and I will execute these first two create table statements, and it looks like it returned successfully. And I've got some selects here just so that we can check the result. So first I'll check the detail table, and there we have the detail table. Primary key as the rental ID, and all the columns that I wanted to set up with the data types mirroring those from the source data. And the next table was the rental summary table, so let's quickly check that one. And there are the columns that I wanted. Okay, great. So the tables are created, and the next step is in part C. Here I have some drop table statements for testing purposes, which are commented out for right now. Section C is insert into select statement. I got information on doing this from W3 Schools, and so I'm going to be inserting into from the columns from the rental table and the inventory table. So in order to do that, I did an inner join with the first table being rental and joining to the inventory table on the inventory ID column, which they share. So that is going to accomplish pulling the columns from two different tables and inserting them into my new table, which I just created above, rental detail. One trip up on this one is that originally I didn't have the distinct on keyword here, and I was getting an error that there was a uniqueness violation on the rental ID column, which is supposed to be unique, primary key column, but had duplicate values and was throwing that error. So in order to create a unique row for every record, I used the distinct on keyword, also referenced from W3 Schools, on the rental ID here. It needs to be specified when using this keyword in order to select just one row from a duplicated row, and then specify, as usual, the columns to insert into after that. Okay, so that resolves the issue of the data integrity problem. So I'm going to go ahead and execute this insert into the detail table, specified all the columns that I created above, and I'll select it again. And I don't have to do this order by. I could go ahead and do that. Descending, kind of want to just do it regular. And there we go. All the data is populated in the rental detail table as I wanted it to be, so that's great. So next step, there we go. Next step, I wanted to transform the data in some way, perform some kind of function on this data. And the useful bit of information that I discussed might be useful to the inventory manager would be to know the amount of time that a title was rented out. Here we can see the return date and the rental date, but wouldn't it be nice to know the time difference between those two dates quickly in another column? So what I'm going to do is add that column with an alter table statement command, adding a new column called days rented out. And this is an interval type, which was different from how to do that in MySQL. So yeah, this was specific for PostgreSQL. And let's check to see if I was successful in adding that column. Select this again. And there it is, days rented out. It's an interval type. And now I actually want to populate that column, set the value with an update statement, and it's going to be equal to the rental date minus the return date minus the rental date. So that's going to give, in a positive sign, the amount of time that each record was out for. And let's see if that worked. Select it again. And here we can see some null values for titles that were never returned. But after those, it starts again here at the first ID and shows 1 day, 3 days, 7 days, which is consistent with the date stamps, timestamps here. So it looks like that works. That's great. Okay, and now that could be some useful information for the inventory manager. All right, great. That's the data transformation. And next, I wanted to use a trigger with a function with a trigger, to compile this summary data, which again was to look at the store ID, the film ID, and the frequency of how many times these titles were rented out. Okay, so that's the meat of this function here. And this code template for this function I referenced from the PostgreSQL tutorial website. It had a pretty detailed explanation on how to set up not only the function, but specifically for a trigger. And here we can see it's returning a trigger. So this is a function for use with a trigger. So that's where that came from. And here is the code unique to my situation. I'm going to first delete. Well, let's look at the trigger. So this is going to trigger after an insert, and it's going to happen after the insert so that the insert can go ahead and be completed into the rental detail table. And here's my example. It's going to insert a new row into the rental detail table, all the columns specified, with the data that's available up into return date. Now the days rented out is the new column that I added, so I'll have to deal with that in my function. And then the values, I set up some dummy values for store number 1, film number 1, and then just some dummy dates there. So once I perform that insert into, I want it to insert, and then after inserting, trigger my function, which I've called update summary. Yeah, that's the procedure. Okay, so here I've specified the procedure and described the commands that will be executed in the procedure. First, I want to clear the rental summary table, because if this is done repeatedly, I want to refresh it each time. So this is just going to delete from, since no rows are specified, it's going to do all rows from my rental summary table, and then insert back into it every row from the, so all the store IDs, film IDs, and then count for those columns, which is going to give me my frequency of how often a particular film ID from a particular store was rented. It needs to be store specific, because if this was just all the films across the company, it doesn't really tell you which shelf in which store needs additional copies. So that's why the store ID is there. All right, and it's pulling that from the rental detail table and grouping by so that it will consolidate this data by the store ID and then by the film ID, and then ascending for the film ID. I specified that, although that is the default anyway. And then in order to make that detail table relevant, if I don't update it and set the days rented out again, my new record is going to have a null value in the days rented out. So I wanted to include that just so that the purpose of this is mainly for the summary table, but just to make that detail table new row complete, I've included that statement in there. Okay, so there it is. I'm going to go ahead and run my sample value with just a very high rental ID, so it'll stand out, and see what I get. Okay, I can see it was successful. Now I'm going to look and select all the rows from detail and see what came out there. And here I can see my first, in the first row, my new column listed. And okay, I need to do that again because I executed only the insert into, and I didn't execute the entire command. So yeah, let me try that again. And because this command hasn't been executed yet, I need to do that at least once, or once and only once. Okay, so I did it again. I changed the number of that rental ID. I didn't say that, but that's what I did so that I get another unique record. Okay. Now let me just try that again. Okay, there's my original one. Now it's showing the interval. And let me go ahead and do it this way so that I can see both of them. Okay, now it's starting from the top with the biggest number. And now I got both those new records, and now they're both showing the interval. Okay, so let me look at my summary table and see if that one also populated. And yes, it looks like it's working. Okay, so I see the store IDs listed here starting from number 1, and I see the film IDs, and it looks like films number 2 and 3 were not rented at all from store number 1. And it looks like film ID number 1 was rented 14 times, which is probably actually should be 12 because I added 2 of my own rows there, and it's counting those also. And it's giving me a count of the frequency of those films. This is what I wanted, and this is what's happening. So that's great. There's store ID number 1. And additional, this is a summary, but it is including every store. I didn't want to limit it to any particular store from the beginning. But this is a pretty long list of records, admittedly. But it could be further refined to include specific stores or only over a certain amount of times rented. But this is kind of the starting point for the summary information. So that's how I created this data. I didn't want to take it too far down any particular road. So here's store number 2. And it looks like it's also working. Okay, it's looks like almost every film was rented here, except 53 wasn't, and it's counting the number of times rented out. So that's great. It's doing what I want it to do. Let me just do that one more time to make sure that the times rented is incrementing as I want it to. So I'm going to add another film, and this time all I need to do is run the insert into command because the function and the trigger are already set up. So I don't need to execute those again. In fact, it's going to give me an error if I try to execute them again because they already exist. So I'm going to run that. I've got to order it so that I can see my new ones at the top. And there it is. Okay, and then let's check the rental summary. And now it's 15. So it's working. It counted my new record. All right, so that takes me through the trigger and the function related to it. Pretty cool. And now the last section was to create a stored procedure that could be run on a schedule. Now, I haven't gone through the scheduling part of it. I've described that in the write-up for this project, which could be accomplished with a Python statement, Python script or program to set up a connection with the database, and then run that with a cron tab, a cron job. So that there's information referenced in my write-up on how to do that. For this, I'm just creating the procedure and then calling the procedure just to show that it works, and it could be called on a schedule, but I'll just perform it manually here. Okay, so this procedure I called refresh, and it is just going to be something that the inventory manager can do to wipe the data from the detail table and the summary table, refresh it on a periodic basis to remain relevant. And I think that bi-weekly is the best period of time to do this for a DVD rental store, which don't really exist anymore. But if it was every week, it would be a little, maybe too much of a burden time-wise for a manager to do and provide relatively little value. Monthly wouldn't be often enough because DVD titles are coming out all the time and they want to stay on top of the changes in the popularity of them to know how often to stock them on the shelves. So this stored procedure should be run once every 2 weeks. Okay, and what it does here, this is the code for it, and the template was referenced. I referenced it from PostgreSQL tutorial website also. So that's all there set up for me, and I copied that in. But this is specific for my task, deleting from the rental detail and summary table. It's going to get rid of all the rows, but keep the table and the columns. And then this is the same insert into from above using the distinct on, pulling the data again fresh from the raw database, and just like before. Okay, so I'm going to have to first create this procedure. So I'm going to execute this command. That's great. Okay, and then the next command here is to call the procedure to perform it. Okay, run that. So now I called it. All right, so now my new records should be gone. It should have wiped it and started with a clean slate. And that's as far as that stored procedure's purpose was to go. So yeah. Of course, that stored procedure could be refined further, but we can see now that my new dummy columns that I had inserted are now gone. The rental summary table shows 12 times rented, which is the number that I said should exist before I had added those two dummy rows. And now let's see if my trigger and function are still working. I'll go ahead and change this, and since those were executed, those still should be existing here in my program. So I'll just do the insert and the trigger should run. Like it did before. And there it is. The interval is there, and now the frequency for store number one, film number one, should have gone from 12 to 13, and there it has. So it's great. That completes everything that I wanted to do in this project, and I think this could be some useful information for a business out there. Thank you very much.